So in the last couple of classes, we have discussed the organization of the nervous system. So we looked at the cortical pathways, right? The simple input-output kind of description of the cortical pathways. We also looked at the subcortical systems and how they form loops with the main cortical pathways. So we have set up the problem. We now have a kind of a broad understanding of various parts of the brain and its overall organization. Now let us look at one specialized topic about how information is represented in the brain. Now, so we can say that brain is a big information processing system. It's a slightly vague statement, but it's a valid statement. It's okay to say that. Now, if you ask, how is information represented in the brain? Because you store information in the brain. How is it represented? Right? Obviously, it is presented in the form of neural activity. Right? And so now, how is it represented in neural activity? What exactly does a neuron say about information? How is it encoded? So it's lots of theories, and it's not a complete story. But there's one thing that you can say, and for which you can get a lot of evidence, and you can justify that statement, which is that information is organized in the form of two-dimensional maps in the brain. Now, so that is typically in various cortical areas, and also in some subcortical areas, information is organized in the form of maps and in the form of two-dimensional layouts. Now, that's not true for all brain, but it is true for lots of brain regions, both in the cortex and in subcortex. Okay, so first of all, what is a map and what are these brain maps? So let us talk about that. So a map is basically a representation, usually on a planar surface, right, of a region of the earth or heaven. So this is the dictionary definition. Now, so it has any map should have some basic features, which is that since it is a map of something in the real world, usually a two-dimensional terrain or something like that, there should be a one-to-one correspondence between the real world and the map, and nearby regions in the world must be mapped onto nearby points in the map. It may not be drawn to scale. It can have local distortions. Some maps come very clearly with this disclaimer that it's not drawn to scale. Okay, that is fine. And can be local distortion. For example, even if you look at world map, right, the Earth's surface is a spherical geometry. When you stretch it out and lay it out on a two-dimensional, flat, planar surface, there will be very profound distortions. Right, Antarctica, for example, looks very big. Looks as if it stretches out the entire bottom edge of the rectangle. When you display the world map on a rectangular sheet, right? So all these are inevitable when you make the transformation. There can be local distortions, and sometimes local distortion could be slightly funny, like this map of New York. So generally, there's a lot of complaint that I don't know if you're familiar with this New York humor. That is, New Yorkers really think no end of themselves. They think New York is the greatest place on earth, and everybody else is kind of lesser human. So this is a map of a New Yorker that depicts a New Yorker's worldview. So 9th Avenue is apparently, even I don't know exactly where is 9th Avenue in New York, but it's apparently some kind of an important street in New York. So in this map, it shows 9th Avenue. Beyond that, you can see 10th Avenue. And if you go a few streets like that, you'll see the Hudson River, right, somewhere in the middle. Okay, and then beyond that, you see the entire North America, right, in the United States. There's Chicago here, and there's Canadian border here, and beyond that, you see Pacific Ocean. Beyond that, you see Asia. So pretty much entire world is just sitting right next to New York. New York is so big, so important, and other world areas in the parts of the world are very small next to it. Because it's a very vain, egoistic kind of representation. So map can have serious distortions. So brain maps also in these maps, information is laid out on 20 sheets of neurons. There are lots of such maps, right, all over the brain surface, particularly in the primary sensory and primary motor cortical areas. Right. So the thing is, maps of more kind of a subtle, abstract kinds of information in the brain, they are difficult to depict. But maps that correspond to the more primary sensory areas or primary motor areas, they are easy to understand, and so they are well worked out. So some of the earlier studies on these brain maps was done by they were done by Wilder Penfield, who was originally a Canadian neurosurgeon. He was at McGill University and all that. So this guy, he's discovered a lot of brain maps by actually stimulating the brain electrically. So he would put electrode, expose the brain, pass some currents with an electrode in various parts of the brain, and see what the patient or the subject experiences. Suppose he did that, for example, he was stimulating the occipital lobe somewhere here. We know that the occipital lobe has areas that respond to vision. So if you electrically activate those points of occipital lobe, the patient says he or she is experiencing flashes of light. So there's no real light. Eyes could be closed for all that you know. But just because the visual parts of the brain is activated, they experience flashes of light. So similarly, if you activate the auditory cortex, especially the primary auditory cortex, somewhere here in the superior temporal gyrus, they hear sounds. Sometimes they hear sounds of some song maybe that they have heard long ago, right? Or they might hear voices. It might feel as if somebody is talking in the room, but there's nobody in the room talking, right? So, and similarly, if you pass currents in the motor cortex, right, they might have some muscles might be twitching, right, or there may be some movement of fingers or foot or something like that. So, and so he's done very intricate analysis of such brain stimulation and described which part of the stimulation of which part of the brain will produce what kind of experience, and that's how he has made his brain maps. Now you might be wondering how come this guy was able to allow to open human brains and to perform all these experiments, right? The thing is, he was not doing it just for sake of scientific curiosity. He was doing it as a part of a treatment, particularly for treatment of epilepsy. So epilepsy, I think I would have mentioned once before, is a case of uncontrolled activity in the brain, uncontrolled spreading of synchronized neural activity in the brain. Usually the activity starts in one part and spreads to the entire brain. So that kind of a starting point is called the epileptic focus. So usually it is located inside the temporal lobe. So like in the last class, I think we were talking about this patient HM, right? So this guy was suffering from epileptic seizures. So they simply removed the temporal lobe, and that's why the hippocampus was also gone, and he was having all these memory problems. So Penfield and his group, what they would do is, instead of removing the entire temporal lobe, right, you identify the specific part of temporal lobe and surgically remove only that part. Now, how do you find the specific part of temporal lobe which is causing the epileptic seizures? So how do you find that focus? Because that focus would seem like normal tissue, right? The only difference is if you electrically stimulate it, the circuitry has kind of got distorted there in such a way that if you electrically stimulate it, it will trigger widespread activity all over the brain, right? So the only way to identify that kind of a epileptic focus is to electrically probe the entire temporal lobe and find this area. So as a part of that probing study, Penfield and his group, they were actually stimulating, since anyway you have exposed the brain, anyway you have to stimulate and probe the entire temporal lobe, right? So may as well temporate the whole, may as well stimulate and explore the whole brain just to see what is happening in the other parts of the brain. This was way back in 1930s. So I did that, and they published many different this brain map pictures. So people found that in certain parts of the brain, the maps are not that distinct, not that dramatic. Like for example, in the prefrontal cortex, if you stimulate, you may not have a nice map-like responses. But if you stimulate the primary sensory area, so primary motor area, like I was saying before, especially the the primary somatosensory area, which is responsible for touch, right? If you stimulate that, the person might feel that certain part of the body is touched, right? So that shows that different specific parts of the body, right, activate specific parts of the brain in the somatosensory cortex. So you see that see the left part here, the left diagram picture here, right? If you say touch the person's tongue, right, this part of the cortex gets activated. Okay, if you touch the person's lips, this part will get activated. Face, anyway, this part will get activated. Nose here, eye here, thumb here, right? Index finger, middle finger, ring finger, little finger, hand. You see that the hand is mapped onto a pretty large part of the somatosensory cortex. Then this is the wrist, elbow, arm, shoulder, head, neck, trunk. This is very funny, right? Trunk is a huge surface, right? The whole abdomen, and all that abdomen and hip is all just mapped onto the small region. Again, leg, foot, and all that, and it's a huge region. So thing is, there is a map structure. Different parts of the body are mapped onto different parts of this kind of cortical area. This cortical area you can see here is in the post-central gyrus, the orange part, right? It's a very small part. It's like actually a strip running top down vertically. The whole body is mapped onto that thin strip, and here also the right part of the body is mapped onto the left somatosensory area. And so nearby points in the body are mapped onto nearby points in the cortex. That's why you call it a map. But otherwise, it's not at all to drawn to proportion, drawn to scale, right? Because trunk is a huge area in real terms, but it's mapped onto only a small part of the cortex. And hand is relatively small area, but it's mapped onto a huge part of the cortex. Even face, especially the part of the face around the mouth, is a small area in real terms, but it's mapped onto a large part of the cortex. So it looks like the real purpose of the map is just to not just to kind of reproduce the body surface as it is, but represent the body in terms of the relative importance of that part of the body surface. What does that mean? Which part of the body surface is supplying more information, is more rich of in terms of information as a source of information? Yeah, so the richer that part is, the more the area that is allocated in the brain. Hands, for example, are a rich source of touch information, right? Similarly, face and lips and all that, and even the internal parts of the mouth, like larynx and tongue and all that. So any guesses what has tongue to do with the touch? Right? Why is such huge area given to the tongue, pharynx, and all that? Any idea? Why are the internal parts of the mouth given such huge importance in the somatosensory area? Any suggestions? Comments? Hello.
To be able to feel the food that we eat.
Very good. That's one thing. That's a very important thing. Especially certain foods are slightly dangerous to eat, right? Can you think of any example? One popular food in Chennai. Okay, I'm just joking. Okay. Think of how you eat murukku, right? Murukku, if you don't eat properly, you have to very carefully judge the angle orientation of the murukku inside your mouth and turn it around and bite it carefully. Otherwise, you're going to punch holes in your tongue, right? Because it can be quite sharp. So that involves a lot of processing touch information. Okay, so I'm just joking. But the real source of touch when it comes to internal parts of the mouth is speech. Because if you want to produce different speech sounds, so the thing is when you utter consonants, you have to close your oral cavity at very specific parts to produce specific sounds. Suppose you are producing ka, right? You have to close the oral cavity at a place called velum, right? Whereas if you utter it sounds like ta, tha, da, and all, you have to touch your teeth with your tongue. Okay, so you have to manipulate very precisely, and so you need to have very fine touch inside the mouth. So the speech output is a big part of our motor output. I mean, it might be small in terms of area occupied, but it's a very important function. Therefore, that all the organs around the mouth, which are involved in speech, are given huge representation. Only hands are huge representation. Again, your foot and sole and toes of the feet, they are given a lot of. They have a lot of the source of touch information. So basically, what happens here is in this case is the density of the touch receptors, right? What are more technically called the mechanoreceptors. These are located inside the skin. These are the ones which supply information to the somatosensory cortex. And depending upon the relative density of these receptors, right, in various parts of the body surface, the corresponding body surface has a greater or lesser area allocated in the cortical surface in the primary somatosensory area. Similarly, if you go to the motor map, right, in the motor map also different body parts are controlled from different parts of the primary motor cortex. So here also you can see that as you can see here so when you talk about, so in case of skin, in case of touch, information is coming from skin, right, which is a local specific point in the skin. Whereas in case of motor function, your output is not controlling one point on the body surface. So whenever you perform motor function, you are controlling a muscle, and muscle is an external object. It's like a rope, piece of rope, right, connecting 2 points on the body surface which are well separated. So it's a lot more non-local in your influence. Your output of the motor cortex is more non-local. Therefore, this whole region of the primary motor cortex is responsible for vocalization, salivation, and all those things. Mastication, that is eating and munching food. All right, all that is done from control from this part of the primary motor cortex. Also, you might notice that the motor cortex folds deep inside and goes back in. So here also there is motor cortex. Okay, so usually you think only the outer, more visible exposed surface is the only thing that is doing all the work. Okay, so similarly, other parts of the face like brows and you can control your facial expressions, right? All that is controlled from this part. Similarly, hand. So here also trunk has very small representation because you can't do much with the trunk. I mean, how much control do you have on the trunk muscles? Not much. Okay, so because there are no joints and the rib bones are not flexible joints, they're rigid. There's not much control, so therefore not much area allocated. So all these body parts. One more thing you can notice about this map is the maps have serious fractures or serious cuts in them, because see, from the head you need to connect to the neck, right, and neck to the trunk. Whereas where is the neck here? Neck is almost not seen here. The neck is actually here, right? And hand is next to the face, okay, which is actually that cause lots of interesting problems under certain disease conditions. But in the real body surface, hand is not next to the face, right? The face is next to the neck. But so there is a very interesting, very deep distortions of this map from body surface to the cortical surface. So people started making this kind of pictures, right, just to show, give an idea that there is some kind of a little human being sitting inside the brain and processing all our sensory inputs and controlling all our movements. And they call this imaginary person, right, the homunculus. Homunculus means little man. Okay, so just to show all these distortions and disproportionate features, right, they've made these kinds of pictures. And people would even make small figurines of this kind of a chap and put them on the table just to show that, right, how much we have progressed in terms of our understanding of the brain. But actually speaking, if you look at motor cortex, right, the maps are not that clean, right? That people have known even in the way back in 1940s, the last century. But since the story looks very nice, it sounds very good, you can tell small children, and they'll feel all impressed about it. So they tell these stories, but even textbooks carry these kinds of pictures, but actually they're not very true. Particularly model maps are not this clean. Okay, so for example, if you stimulate, let us say, this part which says thumb, right? First time you stimulate, your thumb moves. Second time thumb moves. Third time thumb moves. But fourth time thumb may not move. Some other finger might move. It's quite possible. So which means that this map idea is not correct. Okay, so the many such features which show that the maps are not that clean. The boundaries are not clean. But anyway, this map idea kind of sticks. There's a nice story to tell. So other areas also have maps, especially visual areas. A lot of work has been done on maps of the visual system, and even there was even a Nobel Prize, at least one way back. Maybe there are other Nobel Prizes later, given to discovery of maps in the visual system. Some of the earliest work on maps in the visual system, the visual cortex, came in the context of World War, and that's almost like 1 century ago, during World War I, right? When these soldiers come, war victims come, with problems, right? One kind of problem is penetrating wounds in the head. They come with head injuries because of bullet injuries or shrapnel injuries. That is, some explosion takes place, and metal pieces fly in all directions and penetrate your body, penetrate the head. Right, and when that happens, when these injuries happen to certain parts of the visual system, the occipital lobe, people have vision problems. People have some kind of temporary or a local, very focal blindness, right? And Interestingly, there's a little historical allusion here. So the people used to come with this kind of injuries for the reason of which depends on the design of the helmet. So the upper helmet picture shows the British helmet in World War I. The lower one shows the German helmet. In fact, you might have noticed that the German helmet looks a bit like the Darth Vader helmet. So I guess Darth Vader was in fact inspired by the Nazis. Okay. So which helmet do you think is more protective, German or British? Anybody? Hello? You guys are
German.
asleep? Okay. Hello?
German, sir.
Why?
It's a bit longer cover.
Yeah, it's a bit longer. And which part of the body is protected by this German helmet compared to British helmet?
The start of the spine.
Yeah, right. So the back of the brain and the upper part of the spine at the nape of the neck, right? So that is where they have extra protection. And that's particularly important because, say, one of the most gruesome features of World War was, you might have heard of this, something called trench warfare. People used to dig up these trenches and sit in the trenches for days and weeks altogether. They would eat and do everything in those trenches. It's quite disgusting place. So now once in a while you would stick your neck up and see if you see some enemy, far out there somewhere, you would shoot. When you stick your neck up, what happens? Right, your head and the neck will be the most vulnerable part of the body because the rest of the body is in the trench. So somebody shoots you from the back, right? You're going to get hit in the neck and or in the back of your head. So therefore, the German design was a much better design because it will completely protect your neck, and that's the neck and the head. That's the part which is more vulnerable. Because in the front you can at least see, in the back you cannot see, right? So because of the bad design of British helmets, people used to come with a lot of head injuries, and in the lower part of the brain, I mean that's what is more particularly exposed. That is occipital lobe, the occipital pole, as they say, as a tip of the occipital lobe, which is where you have the primary visual cortex. So these are like very small focused injuries to the visual cortex, and because of that, they experience what are called scotomas. Scotomas means wherever there is injury in the cortex, in the corresponding part of the visual scene, they won't be able to see anything. It just look like a dark patch. Okay, so when they would go with these kinds of injuries, the doctor would evaluate to find out where exactly the location is, right? So they'll show a screen like this. In the screen, they ask them, okay, can you see this point? Can you see this point? Can you see this point? They evaluate the accuracy with which they can identify things in different parts of the screen. And wherever they have very poor vision, they mark it. Now later on, maybe when they did the surgery, they will know where exactly the shrapnel was embedded in the brain, and they can map the location of the shrapnel in the visual cortex with the deficit in the visual deficit as it is found in this optometry kind of a study. And when they compared that, the bullet wounds and the scotomas, where do they have the deficit in the visual field? They found that when the wound was located below, right in the brain, right below the occipital pole, that's the tip of the occipital lobe. This scotoma, that is this deficit in the visual field, was located in the upper part of the visual field. If the injury is in the lower part of the brain, below the occipital pole, the scotoma, which is the visual deficit in the upper part of the visual field, and the injury is above, the scotoma is below. So this is one feature. Second thing is when the injury was on the right brain, right occipital lobe, the scotoma was on the left. So you see that there's a total inversion. Right upper part of the visual field goes to the lower part of the brain, and left visual field information goes to the right brain. So everything gets flipped when you go to the brain. Now, so that to understand exactly there's an interesting kind of a mapping between the visual scene out there and the points in the brain where that information goes to. So to test that more accurately, people have performed some experiments on monkeys. So monkey is shown like a grid pattern like this. So where the radius is called eccentricity, because eccentric means off center. It's called eccentricity because it tells you how much you are off the center. This is the center. So that is a variable epsilon. And then azimuth, right? this angle. So it's like basically r and theta, polar coordinate. So this is a polar coordinate representation of the visual field. So they show a kind of a black and white grid pattern like this. In response to that, so when you show a grid pattern like this to a monkey, right? In response to that, neurons will fire, and wherever there is white, neurons fire. Wherever there is black, they don't fire as much. So they inject some kind of radioactive glucose into the animal, and so based on where the neurons are more active, they release some kind of radiation. So you can capture the pattern of neural activity in the visual cortex by measuring the radiation using some kind of a X-ray film, right? And so those pictures look something like this. So the picture on the left is a kind of what is called a radiograph, right? Captured using the kind of experiment. Obviously, you cannot do this kind of experiment with people because you have to, you cannot just inject radioactive material in a human subject just like that. So that map looks something like this, right? You have like a grid-like pattern, and in fact, if you draw a more simplistic, more mathematically formal version of this, they found that the x-axis in this plot. So this is the cortical surface, right? This two-dimensional surface of the visual cortex. The x-axis here represents the azimuth angle, this A, and so sorry, the x-axis represents the radius epsilon, right? And the azimuth angle is the y-axis. Okay, so that means points that are farther away from the center are mapped further out on along the x-axis, and points which are out in the correspond to higher azimuth angles are represented in the y-axis. Positive azimuth is upper, and positive azimuth is lower, and negative azimuth is upper. So basically, polar coordinates seem to become rectangular coordinates. That r becomes x-axis and theta becomes y-axis. So this very interesting mapping can be captured using a single formula like this: capital Z is equal to lambda times ln Z. This Z is actually a complex number. You know your complex numbers from your high school maths, right? So if you represent this point as a complex number, like r into e to the power of I theta, that will be the complex representation of this point. Now the same thing will now become r becomes some kind of log z or ln z on the x-axis, and I theta becomes the vertical axis or the imaginary axis. So that's a very strange kind of you will be really surprised to find that something a messy biological system like the brain can use something that is mathematically so sophisticated like the complex log function. So this function is not, this result has not just come from this one species, but they have worked out this kind of mapping from many species and found that with small variations of this formula, you can fit this mapping from the visual scene out there to the visual cortex. So this map is called the retinotopic map. So now, right from the visual scene to the visual cortex, there is an interesting mapping. Now, if you look at the response of single neurons, right, in the visual cortex, they tell a very interesting story. Now, as you know, we have discussed this before, that in the visual system, the journey of the visual information starts in the retina. In the retina, you have these photoreceptors. In the retina, in addition to photoreceptors, you have at least 4 different types of neurons. In fact, recently I had a talk where this guy was saying that there's something like 27 different neuron types in retina itself. So obviously, it's a very complex circuit. Now, retina also has, the outputs of retina come from neurons called ganglion cells. Now, these cells respond to simple local dots. The dot could be a white dot in a dark background or a black dot in a white background, right? So that's what it responds to. Similarly, the next stage in the visual system, if you remember from our last class, is the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is a part of the thalamus. So there also you will find neurons which respond to dots. So it is as though in the visual system, if you probe the response of neurons in the lower stages of the visual system, you will find that they are simply responding to dots, nothing very fancy. But moment you go to the third stage of the visual hierarchy, which is the primary visual cortex or V1, you find that neurons respond to oriented bars, right, or lines or edges. They don't respond to dots anymore. So in fact, this discovery has, it was found quite serendipitously because this Hubel and Wiesel at Harvard have done these studies. In fact, one of the postdocs who was doing these studies once in the lab, he apparently he tried all sorts of stimuli and nothing was producing any response in the V1 neurons, and the experimental setup goes with something like this. So you show a pattern right out there on the screen, and that stimulus goes into the eye, and that image is formed on the retina, and that goes to LGN, and that goes to the V1. So they poke an electrode in V1 and record the responses. So this guy was trying all sorts of dot stimuli and nothing is working. There's no response at all. So once he was accidentally changing the slides to replace one stimulus with the other with another stimulus. At the time when the slide was being changed, the neuron suddenly fired. Then he was wondering like what happened? What did the neuron respond to? Then he realized that when the slide is being changed, slide is some kind of rectangular slide. When the slide is being changed, the edge of the rectangle is what is producing the response in the neuron. So that's what he noticed. That was quite a very insightful discovery. So then they started making stimuli itself in the form of lines, or in a sort of line which are slightly thick like bars. And then they found that every neuron has some kind of an optimal stimulus. Some neurons respond to vertical bars, some neurons to horizontal bars, some neurons to bars of certain specific orientation. So all in all, the neurons in V1 respond not to dots, unlike the neurons in the lower layers, but they respond to bars of specific orientation. So just to test that, if you give like a simple kind of non-oriented stimulus, like just a dot of light or a disk of light, like what is shown on the right, you won't find much response. So in all these cases, here, when you show the vertical bar, it's showing a lot of response. This black lines indicate firing events. So it is producing a series of action potentials. But when you show a horizontal bar, right, there's no response. So this neuron is said to be tuned to the stimulus of a vertical bar. On the other hand, if you give it a general disk, there's no response. So these kinds of cells, which respond to oriented bars, oriented features, they're called orientation cells or orientation sensitive cells. And among them, there are further subcategories. For example, there's something called simple cells, which respond when oriented line is present at the center of the receptive field. So here we have a very important concept called the receptive field. That is, so to understand it, let us look at this. Now, this is the retina. At next, let us look at, so this is LGN. Then let us look at the V1. Okay, a neuron here receives input from this part of the retina. A neuron here receives input from this part of the retina. So that means what it means is it can see the activity from this part of the retina. So that part is called its receptive field. That is the field from which it receives information. Similarly, a neuron in V1 will receive input from certain part of the LGN. So this is its receptive field. So because of this kind of architecture, if an LGN neuron can only see so much of retina, a V1 neuron, since it can see lots of LGN neurons, it can see a much bigger part of retina. You see this whole thing, right? So the higher you go in the visual hierarchy, the larger is your receptive field. Okay, so that's the concept of receptive field. Now, within the V1 itself, there are different kinds of cells which respond to oriented bars. So there's something called simple cells, which respond only when the bar is in the center of the receptive field, the circular receptive field. But if you present the bar here, slightly to the side, or here, not much response. But whereas there's another kind of cell called the complex cells, so where it will produce about the same response, no matter where the bar is, in the center or close to the periphery. All of them produce about the same response. So the bar's orientation alone is matters for these cells. Their relative position within the receptive field doesn't matter. These are called complex cells. Then there are a third kind of cell which fire not to the entire bar sitting in the center of the receptive field, but a bar which maybe comes halfway into the receptive field and stops there. So it's the end of the bar is stopping inside the receptive field. These are called the end stopping receptive field. So basically, there's a whole zoo of cells which have all sorts of responses in V1. But the common feature to all of them is that they respond to oriented bars and not to dots. They don't respond to this kind of simple symmetric, radially symmetric features. So some of the kinds of patterns which produce a response in V1 neurons are like edges, and edge again can have can be two kinds with the same orientation, but edge can be of two kinds: white on this side, black on this side, and opposite. Similarly, bars also can be of two kinds. The bar could be white with a black background, and vice versa. So we have seen that neurons respond to some kind of orientation. Okay, and the different neurons respond different orientation. Now, how are these neurons which respond different orientations spatially organized on the surface of V1? So that gives rise to some very interesting answers. Okay, let us do this spatial organization study in several ways. First, let us study what happens if you go into the depth of the cortex. So this is a visual cortex. It has 6 layers, like in most other cortical layers. So if I penetrate this depth of the cortex and measure it with these small electrodes at various and probe the response of neurons at various depths. So I give the same stimulus and probe the response of neurons at various depths. So when these guys did that, what they found is neurons at various depths at the same point in the XY plane, all of them respond to roughly the same orientation. So there's not much difference in what is called the orientation tuning, right, as you go deep into the depth of the cortex at a given point, given XY point. So which is shown is vertical bar here. So these little blocks indicate what is the orientation that produces high response in that neuron. So they basically at every location of the electrode, they would rotate this stimulus completely and see for what rotation or what orientation they get high response in that neuron. And they found that everywhere neurons respond about same angle. There are some places where neurons don't have any orientation sensitivity at all. So like this case, for example, there's not much sensitivity to orientation. They only respond to dots. But these are small in number. But otherwise, mostly neurons respond to oriented bars, and they are all the same in the vertical dimension. But when you probe the cortex in the horizontal direction, right, like pass your electrode, stick it horizontally, and stop at various points and record neural activity as you completely, try all possible orientation at a given position. So then they found that different neurons respond to different orientations. And not only that, nearby neurons respond to nearby orientations. What does that mean? Let us say a neuron here responds to a horizontal line. A neuron next to that responds to a slightly rotated horizontal line. And next one is even more rotated. The next one is even more rotated. And as you go like that, neuron somewhere in the middle of this little slab responds to a vertical line. Now, as you go even further to the end of this little slab, you again have a neuron which responds to horizontal line. And as you go further down in this direction like that, the whole cycle repeats. Right? So this is horizontal line. Again, this will be horizontal line. Somewhere here you will see a vertical line and so on and so forth. Okay, so the nearby neurons respond to similar orientations, and this you go through the same cycle of the entire range of orientations as you keep on going in this in a single direction. Just 1 second. But obviously, visual cortex is a two-dimensional surface. Actually, it's a 3D slab, but we notice that the vertical direction doesn't have much information. So let us look at the 2D version. In the 2D version, so this picture shows how the orientation is distributed in the 2D surface of the visual cortex in V1, right? So you see that these colors, this is a color code of orientation sensitivity of neurons, right? And the same is a yellow. So the same thing is also shown in these little white lines. So yellow represents an angle which is something like, let's say 45 degrees, right? And blue represents something like 135 degrees. Green represents 90 degrees. And red represents 0 degrees or 180 degrees. Both are same in terms of orientation and so on, right? So you see that there's a continuous mapping of orientation along the surface of the visual cortex. In addition, you will find these points where lots of colors meet. So let me here take a dark color. So here you see a lot of colors meet. So here you see yellow, green, blue, purple, red. Okay, and so these kinds of points where lots of colors meet, they are called mathematically they are called singularities. And in neuroscience, in a context, they are called pinwheels, right? Which is where lots of different orientation regions come together. Like even in a, let's say, map of states, for example, in India, you will find some points where maybe 3 states come together. This is some such point. Now, not only that, so these pinwheels are of two types. In one pinwheel, if I go travel in the anti-clock direction, you will go from yellow to green, so yellow to green to blue to purple to red. But in some other pinwheels, you will go in opposite direction. So if you go here, take this pinwheel, go in the anti-clock direction. Okay, this is also yellow to green to blue. But in some places you will find, okay, look at this. This is yellow to red to blue to green. It's opposite direction. So the pinwheel has some kind of a directionality, right? Some kind of a rotation index can be given to the pinwheels. So you can think of two kinds of pinwheels, clockwise pinwheels and anti-clock pinwheels. And people found that they are roughly, both of them occur in equal numbers. So point is, it's really surprising that the brain has chosen to represent visual information, that a very primitive property of vision, which is orientation of lines, right? That is presented in such sophisticated ways in terms of these regions and pinwheels. Now, all this V1 is located here, right? Here and here, very small patch, and so again, as you can see, this part is hidden. You can see from outside. So what you can see from outside is only this part. This part is deep inside and cannot be seen from outside. Now, so information from so this is 2 eyes. These are two brains, 2 halves of this is let me call this the left V1. Let me call this the right V1. Okay. So you see that in the 2 eyes, look at the 2 retinae, right? Each retina can be divided into 2 halves, right? Because the optic nerve goes out of the retina from about the center of the retina. So you have two halves on either side of the center of the retina. And so this part of the retina and is the part which is close to the nose. So therefore, this is called the nasal hemiretina. This part of the retina is what is close to the temples, away from the nose and close to the temples. Therefore, it's called the temporal hemiretina. So if you look at the left eye, on the temporal hemiretina of the left eye, right, you see information coming from the right visual field. Because when the information from the world comes into the eye, it can only come through this tiny aperture, which is in the center of your, your iris, the pupil, right? So if you are seeing something on the right part of the world, that has to go to the left part of the retina. There's no other way, because there's a very small hole. And only when this aperture is sufficiently small, you'll be able to form the image. No matter play it with these pinhole cameras when you're small, right? Eye is just a pinhole camera, and the image formation occurs only when this hole is sufficiently small. So, so the right visual field goes to the left part of the retina, or the temporal hemiretina, for the left eye, and the right visual field goes to the nasal hemiretina for the right eye. So because that's how it is. Similarly, the left visual field goes to the temporal hemiretina of the right eye, and it goes to the nasal hemiretina of the left eye. So basically, the left visual field and right visual field, right, are captured by different halves of the retinae, right, in the two eyes. Now, what brain does so brilliantly is it will reroute all these connections in very interesting ways, in such a way that all the information about the right visual field goes to the left brain. Okay, because right visual field in the right eye goes to this part. So these fibers are connected and they cross over and go to the other part of the brain, the left side. Now left visual field, right visual field is also captured by the temporal hemiretina. These fibers go, or they don't cross over. They go to the same side and go to the left brain. So it's really brilliant kind of a rerouting of information that is captured by the two eyes in such a way that right visual field goes to the left brain, left visual field goes to the right brain. So which means a given neuron in the left visual field gets information from both eyes, from left eye and right eye. Okay, so that gives the basis to another kind of a visual map located in the primary visual cortex. And this map has to do with which eye produces a response in a given eye, a given neuron. So if you look at the visual cortex, right, so this is a visual cortex, you will find that although both eyes send information to both brain areas, because both eyes send information to both brain areas, a given neuron predominantly responds to only one eye or the other. Okay, so here in this, for example, this green indicates left eye and blue indicates right eye. So you will have a bunch of neurons here which respond only to the left eye, another bunch of neurons here which respond only to the right eye. And if you go further down, you again find neurons which respond to the left eye, and further down neurons respond to only right eye, and so on and so forth. So the neurons that respond to right eye and left eye, this is in the same part of the visual cortex, right? They form some kind of a band structure, okay? And so this band structure can be easily seen in one dimension, but same thing if you go to two dimensions, you find the band structure is quite intricate, right? So here you can see that so this is actually colored just for sake of illustration. That is, the entire black patch that you see here represents neurons responding to, let us say, right eye. Then all these white spaces interspersed between the black patches represent neurons as respond to the other eye, let's say the left eye. So neurons that respond to left eye and right eye form very intricate black and white patches, sort of resembling the zebra stripes, right? And this map is called the ocular dominance map, right? And they are called columns because Just like in case of orientation map, if I look at this kind of a left eye, right eye preferentiality in the depth direction, right, there's not much difference. And along the vertical column, all neurons respond either to only right eye or only left eye. There's no change. Only when you travel horizontally, there'll be a change in the preferentiality of the neuron with respect to left eye or right eye. So therefore, these kinds of maps are called ocular dominance columns. Similarly, the orientation maps are also called orientation columns. Columns refer to this fact that in the vertical direction, there is not much change in the response. Now, these maps or these columns are not fixed forever. They're dynamic. So for example, if you, so this is the ocular dominance maps of a monkey that was allowed to grow normally. Whereas in the bottom part, we see a map of a monkey which is what is called monocularly deprived. That is, one of the eyes will be closed right after the birth. Actually, the eyelids will be sutured off, so it cannot open the eye, and it is kept like that for from 2 weeks to 18 months. So this is what is called a critical period. The critical period is where the brain forms maps, and especially for the lower sensory areas. During the critical period, if you seriously distort the kind of simulation that the animal receives, that will mess up the maps, quite thoroughly. And after that, even if you remove that distortion and present it normal, natural stimuli, the maps cannot change much. So that period is very critical. That's why it's called the critical period. For monkeys, it is, I guess, 2 weeks to 18 months. It will be different for different species. Okay, so that is about ocular dominance and orientation maps. But you might have noticed that both these maps are located in the same brain area, the primary visual cortex, or V1. So now another interesting question is, how are these two maps related? How are the orientation sensitivity maps and ocular dominance maps interrelated? So that was described by these 2 points. That is, iso-orientation slabs often cross the borders of the ocular dominance bands at approximately right angles. So these long white lines that you see here are the ocular dominance bands. That is, so in the ocular dominance, you find these bands, right? So these are the white lines are the bands. Only thing is they're not showing the white region and the black region. They are just showing the borders. So one observation says that iso-orientation slabs often cross the borders of the ocular dominance maps bands at approximately right angles. That is, the iso-orientation slabs, that is, slabs which have same orientation. Okay, so if I go along this border, for example, my orientation hasn't changed. Blue represents one orientation, white yellow represents another orientation. It is exactly that middle orientation. If you follow this this curve, my orientation sensitivity has not changed. So that curve is intersecting this borders of the ocular dominance map at roughly 90 degrees. You can see that happening in many places. Okay, so let us see, and so on, right? That is one property. The second thing is the singularities, which are pinwheels, like I was saying earlier, tend to align with the center of the ocular dominance bands. That is, so the pinwheels are like this. Okay, that is roughly in the center of the nearby ocular dominance band. Right, look at this. So now, why should they be like this? Right, there's no simple verbal answer to that. But in this paper, Obermeyer, Glaser, and Schulten, they proposed a very simple model, what is called a self-organizing map, which is very simple. I mean, there is hardly any biology in this. With such simple models, they were able to explain all these phenomena. So this is what this is what tells us that to understand this complex brain phenomenon, you don't always need a very complex model. Even simple models can give great insights and explain a lot of things. So to normally, if you take a classical approach of a biologist, they will take a very complicated neural network model, which is specific to the visual cortex, specific to the monkey's visual cortex, and then get all the numbers and put all the parameters, chemical levels, lengths of fibers, and all the details, right? And try to explain something. But what these guys have shown is you don't need all that, right? At a very high level information processing kind of a model, they were able to explain a lot of these details pretty accurately. Okay, so now let us stop there. In the next class, we'll discuss how these maps form. So we have seen that there are these maps. They're very intricate, and also they're very different from the kinds of things that you would imagine if you were an engineer. If you're an engineer, engineer becomes a god and start designing animal brains. And we would never think of anything like this. It's so strange, the brain design, biological, natural design is so different compared to like a design of a computer. So it's difficult to answer why, but we can at least answer why in the sense, why did brain form this kind of maps? We can difficult to answer. But how can these kinds of maps form? What kind of mechanisms can produce these kinds of maps? That's a more tractable question and answer. Let us discuss that, and also we'll discuss how these maps show up in some of our disease conditions, like the phantom limb phenomenon. Right? If you understand maps, you can explain a lot about the intricacies of the phantom limb phenomenon. And we'll discuss all that in the next class. That is, so next week we don't have classes, so you have a good time, and we'll meet again in the week following. I guess that will be April 6th, or I don't know, whenever is the next Wednesday. Right? Let's meet then and we'll discuss how these maps form. Okay, thanks a lot. You have any questions? Anybody?